John, it's off the radar, but I do want to note the unraveling of Turkish lira. It's ever so gentle, but persistent, John.
The airline stocks year to date on the S&P, they're down 17.5%. Wow. Brutal. Futures up 1.5 on the S&P, yields higher by 5 basis points, back through 190. Two's higher as well. Going into CPI tomorrow morning, crude pulling back down almost 3 percentage points to 120.17.
We know that it's highly transmissible. We know that 2 doses of vaccines, Pfizer vaccine specifically, neutralize the virus, but not as efficiently, because various studies showing that reduction up to 40-fold, meaning that a 3rd dose is a must for it to successfully neutralize the variant. What we don't know is still that what are the effects of mix and matching between vaccines, and what are the capabilities of antibodies produced from this mix and matching in neutralizing Omicron. Because as we know, many parts of the world use different types of vaccines. And that would be a great data to look at. It will be also great to look at, because majority of the studies done uses a small sample number, and most of the time when you translate it to real world, the data changes. So it will be really good to look at large scale data of the ability of antibodies from vaccines to neutralize this variant. Grateful here today that the virus, Omicron variant, still uses ACE2 receptor as its main entry. It means that all of the vaccines which are designed with spike in mind still works. Imagine if it uses a different receptor other than ACE2. None of the vaccines would work today. So I think that is the best news that we got from all these studies which came recently, the past couple of days.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
The situation in Russia-Ukraine invasion is critical for raw materials.
It's adding fuel to an already well-kindled inflation fire.
The longer it goes on, obviously, the larger the ramifications are.
That is putting all of us in a bit of a bind, but it's really putting the Fed into a bind.
They absolutely, positively have to get off the zero bound.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Barrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Bouncing back from a 4-day losing streak from New York City this morning. Good morning for our audience worldwide on TV and radio alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz. Futures up by 1.5% on the S&P 500. We've had the action from the President of the United States, TK. We wait for the reaction from Russia.
Well, the reaction from Russia, we're getting a little more headlines, I would say, out today. The zeitgeist from Russia today, John, is a little more eventful than it was yesterday. But what I do notice in the last hour of surveillance, there's a more constructive tape. There's great correlation here. And I want to be careful here. It's not a turnaround, but there's a relaxation from the tension as witnessed by Euro, Swissy, and gold.
Well, if you're in the Treasury market, Tom, you start to think more about CPI tomorrow morning. The estimate close to 8%. Two's at 166 now, up 6 basis points on the day. High of the year, the highest we've seen going back to 2019.
We touched on this yesterday, John. Let's go there right now. Is inflation tomorrow like payrolls last week? Nobody really cares.
Can you ignore CPI tomorrow, Lisa, like we ignored payrolls on Friday?
Well, it gives you a sense of where we're starting from in terms of how much inflation could go up. And I think this goes to the Jeff Gundlach point of seeing inflation go up to 10% this year and fall back to just 7.5% by year end. That's his call. How much are we looking at momentum that will only be accelerated by what we're seeing in the commodity space, John?
Elsewhere, more sanctions from the EU. More sanctions from the EU and Ursula von der Leyen in the last hour or so. That headline read as follows. We are further tightening the net of sanctions responding to Russia's military aggression against Ukraine. 160 individuals, oligarchs, the Russian Federation Council members, the banking sector in Belarus. Tom, there is a conversation this morning about peak sanctions, and we've been discussing that. Peak sanctions where? From who? The Russians this morning, this coming from the Russian president's spokesman, Peskov. Russia may rethink energy commitments after sanctions. Tom, I don't think we've still fully realised how this will play out in the coming weeks and months.
Well, it's about leakages and the leakages of power and the leakages of authority, something in the world of what Dan Tannenbaum, who's helped us so much on this, into what Secretary of Commerce Raimondo said, I believe it was overnight, John, what Gina Raimondo said is the leakages through China maybe is the one thing we have to focus on.
In the New York Times, Lisa, I know I got your attention too, a stern warning from the Commerce Secretary to Chinese companies that might defy US sanctions, going on to say they would get their own restrictions. The US could cut them off from American equipment and the software they need.
How does this end if you've got the U.S. pressuring China to distance itself from Russia at a time when there were reports yesterday that China is considering taking stakes in some of the major commodity players in Russia as all the big U.S. and European players pull back? How much is this going to evolve into a U.S.-China issue as much as a U.S.-Russia issue?
Futures this morning, they bounced. Let's whip through it. Up 1.5% on the S&P, on the Nasdaq, up by 1.8%. We talked briefly about turning the price action of the last couple of days upside down somewhat. Yields higher by 6 basis points to 190.79 on 10s, and crude, it's a break of 120, Lisa, 119.85, down 3%.
And things are moving very quickly in all directions. The volatility absolutely unprecedented in so many asset classes. Does any of the economic data that we're getting matter? I would argue it does. And at 10 a.m., this particular data point matters quite a bit. We get the January job openings data showing how many people are missing from the workforce, basically. And we have nearly 11 million job openings here in the U.S. How much does this sort of edify this feeling from Jay Powell of an overheating labor market? Again, it is backward looking, but it gives you a sense of how much momentum there is heading into a period of time where disruptions are only going to continue, at least for the foreseeable future. Today, we also get EIA crude oil inventory reports, 10:30 a.m. How much do we see a supply response to what we're seeing in the price action, the highest levels going back to 2008? And then at noon, USDA World Agricultural Supply and Demand Report. To me, this is the bigger story. Food security. All around the world, we're seeing wheat absolutely fluctuate, now limit down on the Chicago Exchange. The volatility has been absolutely unprecedented. Soybean oil futures, I have been watching, especially given China's dependence on some of the Ukrainian and Russian imports for some of these products. And at 1 p.m., the U.S. is planning to sell $34 billion of 10-year notes. We have seen 10-year yields rise at 1.90761 now percent. However, still far below where they should be if you believe the inflation expectations, and you can see that in the real yields, still deeply negative, down at more than 1% below zero, John.
Lisa, thank you as always. Hearing from the Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the UK, speaking in the House of Commons, going on to say that they will set out the UK energy plan in the coming days. Also, this report from Interfax, just getting my attention, Tom. The Russian President, Vladimir Putin, to meet with government members tomorrow, March 10th. The government to discuss minimising sanctions impact. Tom, the amount of companies that have pulled out of Russia in the space of a couple of weeks, what will that labour market look like in the next few months?
Yeah, and that's a key phrase, John, labour market. And one of my themes starting like 3 a.m. this morning was a basic idea of what's the growthiness of all this upset that we're seeing. We're staying away from the measurement of economic growth and what is the key to politics. Politics is about jobs, and it's got to be front and center for Mr. Putin and his people.
Team coverage starts right now with Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern in Washington, Tom McKenzie on the border in Poland. Anne-Marie, first to you. The president has made a move, and now we need to see what he does next on the energy front. What are you focused on?
Well, today I want to see what Russia says that they're going to come out with in terms of this banning of list of commodities. What potentially can we see in terms of repercussions? Less so for the United States, which is definitely more insulated when it comes to reliance on Russia, but definitely for Germany. This is going to be a big problem. And I spoke to Mihail Hodorkovsky yesterday. This is the former UCO CEO. He spent a decade in jail, and then he fled Russia, and he lives in exile now. And he said this was a massive mistake for Western Europe to be so reliant on Russia when it comes to fossil fuels and commodities.
Tom McKenzie in Poland towards Romania and Moldova, away from Belarus, on the border with, I guess, millions of refugees. Tom, I'm not seeing enough reporting on what happens next. The refugees get to the border, then what?
Yeah, Tom, we're on the border, Medica, which is on the border crossing between Poland and Ukraine. Logistically, there are facilities in place. They've been put in place by the Polish military, by the Polish police, and volunteers from all over the world. We've met volunteers from the US, France, Germany, and others. But logistically, this is just the beginning. They've had that journey through Ukraine. They've waited for hours, sometimes days, overnight. Most of them, don't forget, 90% women and children in freezing conditions. It is very cold here. It's snowing throughout the day. This is just the start logistically. They have to work their way through Poland if they find a place of residence, or indeed other parts of Europe. We've had people come down from Germany, put people in the back of their vans and cars and take them off to their residences. The Polish government has put aside $1.7 billion to help fund this. But you're absolutely right. We are in the only opening stages of this. 1.2 million people into Poland just in the last 12 days alone. And it underpins the human toll of this, underpins that decision-making amongst European leaders when it comes to how hard and how aggressive to go on Putin.
Know your map between Romania, Tom, and Poland is Slovakia and Hungary as well. Do they have the reticence that's being reported in the United Kingdom on taking in refugees, or are they using those two borders?
So they've been more generous, certainly, those two nations. Hungary is taking in about 200,000 refugees from Ukraine, but that compares to 1.2 million, again, for Poland. So Poland is taking in the vast majority. The UK, the last stats I saw, had issued just 300 visas or thereabouts for Ukrainian refugees. The UK is a bit player in this. Other nations that border Ukraine are taking in refugees, but it is, again, Poland that is front and centre on this. Overall, you've seen 2.1 million refugees from Ukraine. The biggest refugee flow we've seen in Europe since World War II. The United Nations organiser here told me last night he thinks that could get to 4 million in the next couple of weeks.
Just quickly, Anne-Marie, given this backdrop, this is the reason why you get this urgency and why we got that Gina Raimondo statement about how they're thinking about possibly taking action on Chinese companies that do not comply with sanctions. Do we have any sense of whether there'll be any action on that front in the near term?
Well, Gina Raimondo is basically throwing out this threat and this warning to Chinese companies, and it's a little bit reminiscent of what we saw in 2020 with Huawei, right? That really crippled how Huawei was going to expand, given these sanctions and these bans that the United States was putting on it. Then you saw a number of countries not want to deal with that company, and this is what they're saying to China. If you go against these sanctions that we've laid out, you are going to be cut off from the technology that your companies need to produce this material. So I think it was a pretty stark warning to China, potentially the United States trying to shift China's stance in terms of how they deal with President Putin and Russia.
Anne-Marie, always great to catch up. To Tom McKenzie, fantastic reporting, as always, sir. That headline that we got from Reuters on China, Lisa, that got my attention, yours and Tom's too.
Yeah.
China telling refiners to hold April gasoline and diesel exports. That's the immediate focus for these countries now?
Energy security, food security, these are all immediate concerns, and part of the reason why prices have been fluctuating so much, both in the oil patch as well as other soft commodities, is simply because the likes of China are trying to stockpile ahead of what they see as only increasing disruptions going forward.
And that, Tom, is why you see so many of these commodities trading in so-called backwardation. It's this massive scramble to get everything up front and now.
And how does Africa scramble on food? I'm not quite sure I figured that out. We have David Malpass of the World Bank with us, and I know that will be front and center for World Bank, John. But Ben Laidler in his morning note says, look, this is all great. Food will have a larger impact than oil.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, we said it in the last couple of weeks, Lisa. Energy gets so much more attention because here we are on Wall Street looking at crude, but food, Egypt, wheat.
Yeah.
We talked about it a million times.
86% of Egypt's wheat comes from Ukraine.
What a stat. What a stat. Futures up 1.5% on the S&P, on the Nasdaq up 1.9%. Crude back down 2.4%. WTI 120.75. From New York on TV and radio, this is Bloomberg.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with the first word, I'm Rishka Gupta. In Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky says some civilians are escaping around Kyiv after Russia agreed to open humanitarian corridors, but Ukraine says not all of those pathways are open yet. Meanwhile, the US warns that Russian forces are stepping up their bombardment of Kyiv. Democrats and Republicans in Congress have struck a deal on a long-delayed spending bill that funds the US government and includes $13.6 billion for the war in Ukraine. The measure would pay for refugee assistance and to replace weapons given to Ukraine. President Biden will order government agencies to take a closer look at issues surrounding the fast-growing cryptocurrency market. It's the first attempt at coordinating the government's strategy on digital assets. Still, it falls short of providing a clear direction on regulation. That's something that crypto firms have been calling for. And in South Korea, exit polls in the presidential election show conservative candidate Yoon Suk-yeol with a slight lead. Less than 1 percentage point separates Yoon from progressive Lee Jae-myung. Yoon is hawkish on North Korea and China and favors closer ties with the US. And billionaire bond fund manager Jeffrey Gundlach warns that U.S. inflation may approach 10% this year. He says that underscores the need for the Fed to aggressively tighten monetary policy. The CEO of Double Line Capital also said that bonds are now overvalued whilst emerging markets look cheap. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Rishika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
The first step in building a Connect home is to get your hands on some brains and then cut them up. It all sounds very grim, but Harvard turns out to be quite efficient with its brain harvesting. Jeff's lab can do a year's worth of research with a single mouse brain. Small chunks of the brain are fed into the slicer, where a diamond blade carves off a thin sliver of tissue. The tissue floats along some liquid and onto a piece of tape. The brain slices are then put into this very large machine, where they're photographed in the finest of detail. Software helps stitch the pictures back together into a single 3D image, and algorithms are applied to help make sense of what's going on inside of the brain.
Crypto, you have a world of young people that want their own financial system and their own culture. And it is very powerful, and I'm a big believer in it.
Big things are happening on Bloomberg in March. First, Bloomberg Triple Take, breaking down the day's biggest stories.
Today's Triple Take focused on the energy transition.
Then, the return of Bloomberg ETF IQ.
The last major holdouts of the ETF revolution.
And a debut of Bloomberg Crypto.
The CEO of Binance weighed in.
Finally, David Rubenstein brings you insights and advice from the world's greatest investors on a new season of Bloomberg Wealth. All this March, right here on Bloomberg.
You saw the president bring the IEA together last week to announce a 60 million barrel coordinated release. The U.S. will do 30 million of that. We're actively consulting with our allies and in the IEA context about whether it's appropriate to act and do more with those releases.
Good to hear from Brian Deese, as always, the White House National Economic Council Director. Futures this morning, they are positive 1.6%. We bounced back from 4 days of losses on the S&P 500. The Nasdaq up a little more than 2%. Yields heading north, up 6 basis points to 190.79 on 10s, and crude lower to 120.80. We are down by 2.3%. The effort on energy, Tom, and the supplies of it. Yeah. The Wall Street Journal, here's the quote from them. The White House unsuccessfully tried to arrange calls between President Biden and the de facto leaders of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This is a tough one, Tom. They are not taking his call.
We're thrilled to bring you this morning Ellen Wald with her book Saudi, which is definitive on this. I thought Ellen John was just brutal. I mean, she just was direct.
Well, Tom, the issue right now, I mean, the cartel, is it there to manage the market or to manage the individual foreign policy goals of the individual members? And those two things have never been mutually exclusive at the OPEC story. But at the moment, it feels like it's leaning a lot more to one direction than the other.
I would say there's some complexities, to say the least. Right now, with our global best-in-class commodity coverage is Will Kennedy. He does any number of things for Bloomberg in terms of managing Javier Blas and the rest of the team. Mr. Kennedy joins us this morning. Will, I want to guess that when you were in a dorm room at the University of Sussex a few years ago, you had an electric bill or a gas bill to pay. I think this has been underreported. How much and when are those bills going to skyrocket for Sussex, the rest of Great Britain, and for that matter, Europe?
Well, it was more than a few years ago, Tom, but I think you raise a very important point, is that there's a storm coming here. I mean, there was already a storm coming before the war that, you know, gas and power prices in Europe were unprecedented levels, and that's only intensifying. I mean, gas is down a bit today, but it's rocketed up in the last 2 weeks, and power prices across Europe have been at unprecedented levels of multiples, many multiples of what they were a few years ago. Now, that's not been felt by the consumer yet, because in almost everywhere it's delayed or there are subsidies in place, but governments are increasingly going to face a very, very stark choice. Either they spend hundreds of millions of dollars subsidizing people's energy bills, or there's going to be an inflationary cost of living shock, which is much worse of anything that we've seen yet. We've
got 18 ways to go. I'm going to give you an open question, Will Kennedy, because I'm not smart enough to guess the pipeline. Which pipeline has your most acute focus this morning?
I think it's probably Nord Stream 1, because, again, the Russian government reiterated a threat that it first made a couple of days ago, that it is considering energy supplies and reacting to US sanctions, European sanctions, by cutting supplies themselves. And the pipeline that they've highlighted is, everyone talks about Nord Stream 2, the new pipeline, which is now not going to happen, but for the last decade and more, there's been Nord Stream 1, which brings gas directly from Russia to Germany. There are now hints from Moscow that they will stop that gas flowing, and that has huge implications for the German economy. It would see gas prices rocket, and it would be a real shock. So I think that's where our focus is. Whether they follow through remains to be seen, but the very fact that they're putting that on the table, they've always emphasized with Germany, we are a reliable supplier, and all of a sudden they're saying, in this situation we may not be, and that could be a huge story.
It's definitely a big focus, certainly for Germany and many countries in Europe. Another big story that people are focused on are the wheat fields in Ukraine. And I say this as wheat has been experiencing the most volatility ever. And we were talking with the Ukrainian central bank president. John was asking about how long people can remain out of those fields before it becomes a serious food security issue for the world. How far are we from that point? Do you have a sense?
I think that the world has a food security problem already, a huge one. Wheat has risen almost 80% this year. Edible oil prices, something that is very keenly felt by households, especially in emerging economies where these edible oils represent a huge proportion of their everyday spending. The crisis is here. People are feeling this right now, and they're going to feel it much more in the weeks to come as this ripples through the food supply chain. But I don't think that anyone thinks this is something that's coming or dependent on what happens on the ground in Ukraine over the next few weeks. It's here. Ukrainian exports are close to the world. Russian exports are very hard to trade. That's 25% of the world's wheat exports. We wrote yesterday that those two countries account for 10% of the calories traded globally, if you want to look at it that way. The crisis is here. The only redeeming feature is that rice prices, which are hugely important to Asia, haven't yet risen. That's a market that's concentrated on Asia and not affected. But that aside, this is a food crisis on a par with what we saw in 2011.
Well, are you seeing any signs of increased nationalism kicking in various places? The EU has a huge farm lobby. We know that story well. Just saw this story from Reuters in China asking refiners to halt April gasoline and diesel exports. Do you think we'll see more of that across a range of commodities, Will?
I think governments are going to have to become more involved, and I think those kind of protectionist measures are one thing. I honestly think that some forms of rationing are going to come onto the table, whether that's carless days perhaps, or the management of industrial demand. I think that we're going to see a real squabble. Think about the LNG market. Europe has put forward this plan to replace 2/3 of Russian gas this year. Basically, that means bidding whatever it takes to lure LNG away from Asia.
Yeah.
Now, what does that mean? That means that there's less for China, Japan. They're going to have to pay more. They're going to have to use more coal. For emerging countries like Pakistan that rely on this gas to keep their economies going, this is a catastrophe. So you're seeing it's going to mean a fight for resources, and governments are going to have to get more involved. We've already seen the German government directly fund LNG purchases this summer so that Germany can build up its stockpiles. All of these things are coming in our view.
Will Kennedy, just brilliant. As always, thank you, sir. That's the reality. I don't even think that conversation has got started in a major way. That line from Will there, that we could have carless days, days where you can't drive an automobile, Tom. We need to pull back on energy consumption, and governments haven't even started having that conversation yet with the public in a major way.
We had it in the 70s, and I did the chart the other day on inflation-adjusted commodities off the Bloomberg Commodity Index, John, and let me cut to the chase. Even with this lift up, we're nowhere near where we were in the 70s. John, amount spent on food in Egypt, 34%. Amount spent on food in America, 9%. That's the difference.
Big numbers. Futures up 1.6 on the S&P, on the Nasdaq up 2 percentage points. Yields climbing higher 6 basis points to 191. Crude down 3% to 119.80. From New York, heard on radio, seen on TV, this is Bloomberg.
The Omicron variant and the latest wave have an impact on not only consumer trends, but your business. And do you expect the booster shots to make a difference?
Yeah, booster shot will be make a huge difference. I think it's been accelerated by the huge leadership of the current Prime Minister Kishida. And I'm hopeful that our business will come back in Japan around perhaps mid-February to end of February, because we expect that a peak time will come around that time. And then the government will shift toward the reinvigoration of consumer. That will help us. And we had seen the huge